In a small town wrapped in silence, where everyone knows but no one speaks, a child was running for his life, not just from bruises on his skin, but from the fear that no one would believe him. This is not a story about violence. It's about the silence that follows it. It's not just about a boy who was beaten, it's about a society that looked away. And it's about a woman, lonely, judged, forgotten, who chose to open her door and rewrite the end of his story. Ethan was only 8 years old when the world stopped feeling safe. The bruises began quietly, hidden beneath the sleeves of his shirt, tucked away behind nervous smiles and polite nods. At first, he didn't even understand why it was happening. His father, once a quiet man who read him bedtime stories and lifted him high above his shoulders, had become someone else entirely. The scent of alcohol clung to his clothes like a shadow, and with each drink, the man's voice grew louder, his hands heavier, and his love colder. Ethan learned quickly that silence could be a shield. He stopped laughing so loudly. He made sure his toys were always in place. He held his breath when footsteps echoed through the hallway. But even in his quiet obedience, nothing was ever enough. Every wrong look, every spilled cup of juice, every second too slow to answer, punishment followed swiftly, without warning. Ethan's heart lived in a constant state of alarm, fluttering like a trapped bird in his chest. At school, he became invisible. He memorized the cracks in the walls, stared out windows too often, and flinched whenever someone raised their hand too fast. Teachers noticed the quietness, maybe even the sadness, but no one asked. No one wanted to believe that the bruises weren't just from roughhousing or that the hollow in his eyes wasn't just tiredness. At night, curled beneath a thin blanket, Ethan would stare at the ceiling and wonder if he had done something wrong to deserve it. He whispered apologies into the dark, hoping they might reach someone who could make it stop. But the house always stayed quiet, until the door creaked open again, and the nightmare resumed. By the time Ethan reached high school, the burden of his past had molded him into someone he barely recognized. On the surface, he was the quiet, unremarkable kid in the back of the classroom, always blending in, always holding back. He had become an expert at hiding the chaos inside, the confusion of his mind, and the weight of the world on his shoulders. His classmates saw a boy who walked the halls with his head down, never making waves, always avoiding the spotlight. But underneath the calm exterior was a hurricane of emotions, rage, fear, confusion, and a deep sense of emptiness. The moments of peace were few and far between, and when they did come, they felt fleeting, like the calm before an inevitable storm. At home, things were no better. His father had spiraled further into addiction, a shell of the man he used to be. Gone were the days when he would sit Ethan down and share stories of his own struggles and triumphs, when they would laugh together over dinner. Now, there was only silence, broken only by the harsh sounds of his father's drunken rants or the clink of bottles being thrown across the room. Ethan hated it. He hated the way his father's eyes would glaze over with bitterness and rage, the way he would shout, calling Ethan worthless and accusing him of ruining their lives. Ethan learned to keep his distance, physically and emotionally. He would retreat to his room, trying to escape the chaos, but the words would always find him. They lingered in his mind, sharp and unforgiving, gnawing at him until they became his truth. Still, Ethan carried on. He buried his anger beneath a mask of indifference, telling himself that he just needed to survive. There were days when it felt like he could numb himself completely, shut off every emotion, every thought, and just exist. He was a master of it, of pretending, of being invisible. But as the years passed, something inside of him began to shift. The numbness wasn't enough anymore. His father's cruel words, the years of abuse, the unrelenting feeling of being trapped in a life that was never his choice, they were all starting to fracture the carefully constructed walls around his heart. And it wasn't just his father. Ethan was keenly aware of the world around him. High school was a microcosm of the prejudice and unfairness he had always known, only now it was more subtle, more insidious. The sideways glances from his peers, the dismissive tones when he spoke in class, the jokes they told behind his back, they all chipped away at him. They were reminders of the world he couldn't escape, a world where he was always viewed as different, always less than. He was a black kid in a predominantly white school, and even though the racism wasn't always overt, it was still there, lurking beneath the surface, ready to rear its ugly head at any moment. It felt like he was walking on eggshells every day, trying not to draw attention, trying to keep his head down so that he wouldn't become a target. But inside, something was stirring. A sense of injustice that he couldn't ignore. Every day, Ethan saw the cracks in the world, the way people turned away when they saw injustice, the way they justified cruelty, the way they stayed silent. It ate at him. It made him feel sick, like his insides were burning with the need to do something, anything. He didn't want to be silent anymore. He didn't want to hide in the shadows. The truth was, Ethan was tired. He was tired of pretending that everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. He was tired of feeling like he was nothing but a product of his circumstances, trapped in a life that didn't feel like his own. But more than anything, he was tired of being invisible, tired of his voice being silenced, his struggles dismissed, his pain ignored. The turning point came one cold afternoon in his senior year, when he was walking home from school. Ethan had been running on autopilot, his mind lost in a fog of exhaustion, when he overheard a conversation between two classmates. They were laughing about a story, something about a black kid getting arrested at a party. The details were murky, but the laughter was sharp, cruel, and filled with a kind of unspoken superiority. Ethan's gut twisted. He knew they weren't laughing at the incident, they were laughing at the fact that it was another black person in trouble, another person they could mock without consequence. And something inside of him snapped. The anger that had been simmering under the surface for so long surged to the forefront. It wasn't just about his father anymore. It wasn't just about the abuse. It was about everything, the racism, the systemic oppression, the way the world seemed to bend over backwards to ignore the struggles of people like him. In that moment, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't keep pretending. He couldn't keep hiding. It was time to speak out. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan found himself trapped in a constant battle between his fear and his resolve. Each day, he woke up with a heavy heart, the weight of his decision to speak out pressing down on him. He had never imagined that taking a stand would feel like this, like a never-ending storm raging within him. The fear was suffocating, fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing the very few things he thought he could count on. His mind often raced through all the possible outcomes. What would happen if people turned on him? What if his actions caused irreparable damage to the fragile world he had known? And yet, despite the fear, there was something deeper, something undeniable, that kept Ethan moving forward. The words his father had once spat at him echoed in his mind constantly, each insult becoming a flame that stoked the fire of his determination. His father's voice, harsh, bitter, mocking, was louder now than it had ever been. But instead of letting it break him, Ethan found himself drawing strength from it. His father had always tried to tear him down, always made him feel small, incapable. But this time, Ethan wasn't the boy who hid in the shadows anymore. He had a voice, a purpose, and he was going to use it. The first step had been terrifying, the decision to write an open letter detailing his experiences with racism at school. He sat in his room for hours, staring at the blank page on his screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure if he was ready to confront his own truth. But then, with a deep breath, he started typing. The words flowed from him faster than he could think, raw and unfiltered, as though they had been waiting to escape for years. He bared his soul in that letter, exposed the parts of himself that he had hidden away for so long, his fear, his shame, his rage, and his deep, aching desire for justice. When the letter was done, Ethan felt a rush of exhilaration and terror. He hesitated for a moment, staring at the screen, the publish button taunting him. It was a gamble, a leap into the unknown. Once he clicked that button, there was no going back. But the urge to speak out was stronger than the fear, and so, with one final breath, Ethan hit publish. Immediately, the response was overwhelming. Messages flooded in, some supportive, others dismissive, many filled with venom. His classmates' reactions ranged from admiration to scorn, but the most piercing were the ones from the people he had once considered friends. They called him a troublemaker, a winner, someone trying to cause division. Some even claimed that he was exaggerating, that the things he had experienced weren't that bad, that he was just looking for attention. Ethan had known the backlash would come, but nothing could have prepared him for the flood of hatred that followed. He sat in his room, staring at his phone screen, the cruel words from his peers burning into his mind. It hurt more than he cared to admit. The emotional toll of the backlash was almost unbearable. How could they not understand? How could they not see the truth in his words? But then, something shifted within him. The pain, as sharp as it was, only made him more determined. The hurt was a reminder that he was doing the right thing. He spent the next few days buried in the responses to his letter, reading every message, every comment. Some were supportive, some were outraged, but it was the silence that spoke the loudest. Those who hadn't commented, those who had stood by and said nothing, it was their indifference that made Ethan realize just how deep the problem ran. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't even just about the people at his school. It was about a society that had turned a blind eye to the pain and suffering of so many for far too long. The more he thought about it, the more fired up Ethan became. He couldn't stop now. This was bigger than his school, bigger than the taunts and jeers. He had to keep going, no matter what. He started documenting everything he saw, every moment of injustice, every microaggression, every slight. He began seeking out others who had experienced similar things and, together, they formed a group that aimed to raise awareness and push for real change. But as Ethan's actions grew bolder, the risks became greater. He began to notice people watching him, whispers behind his back, glances filled with suspicion, a sense that he was being scrutinized at every turn. The threats started coming in. Messages telling him to stop, to know his place, to keep quiet. His family noticed the shift in him, too. His father, who had always been cold, distant, and judgmental, grew even more hostile. His insults became sharper, more frequent, and filled with more venom than ever before. It was as though Ethan's decision to speak out was a personal betrayal, a declaration of war against everything his father had ever believed. One evening, after a long day of documenting the stories of others, Ethan was walking home from a meeting when he found himself surrounded by a group of his classmates. They were angry, their faces twisted with rage, their eyes filled with disdain. The leader of the group, Tyler, stepped forward, his voice laced with mockery. "You think you're some kind of hero now?" he sneered. "You think you're changing things by running your mouth?" Ethan's heart raced as he stood there, facing them. His mind raced too, trying to figure out what to do, how to defend himself against the accusations. But he quickly realized that there was nothing to defend. He wasn't here to please anyone or prove anything to these people. He was here because it was right. He was here because he couldn't live in a world where people like him, people of color, people from backgrounds like his, were invisible, ignored, or worse, silenced. "I'm not trying to be a hero," Ethan said, his voice steady, his chest swelling with a quiet pride. "I'm just telling the truth. And if you don't like it, then maybe it's time for you to look at yourselves." For a moment, there was silence, an uncomfortable tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. Tyler's expression faltered, but then, with a grunt, he turned on his heel and walked away, his group following suit. Ethan stood there, his heart pounding, but this time, he didn't feel fear. He felt something else, a deep sense of satisfaction, of knowing that, for once, he had stood up for what was right. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan could feel the shift in the air around him. What began as a personal crusade, an effort to expose the truth, had morphed into something much larger, something uncontrollable. The letter he'd written had sparked a wave, an unexpected flood of conversation, not just within the confines of his small community, but across the city. Local newspapers and TV stations started reporting on it. His name, Ethan Carter, was beginning to appear in headlines, a symbol of resistance. But as the recognition grew, so did the pressure. He felt the weight of it every morning when he woke up, the expectations of people who didn't know him, who didn't understand what this cost him, but who expected him to be their voice. There was no escape from it. No way to shut off the constant notifications, the ceaseless barrage of opinions that flooded his social media, his inbox, his life. The messages were a mix of admiration and disdain, support and hate. The support was heartening at times, people who understood, people who agreed with his fight, people who said, "You're doing the right thing." But the hate, that was something else. It came like a storm, relentlessly battering him from all sides. The angry comments, the threats, the accusations, each one like a stone thrown at his chest. Some were anonymous, others were from people he knew, people he had grown up with, people he had thought of as friends. Their words stung in a way that cut deeper than any physical wound ever could. And then there were the long, lonely nights. The nights when the silence of his room became deafening, when the weight of the world pressed on his shoulders so heavily that he could barely breathe. He would sit at his desk, staring at his phone, wondering if he'd made the right decision. Was it worth it? Was fighting for justice, for truth, worth losing everything he had built? His father had all but disowned him, bitterly condemning Ethan for what he saw as betrayal, for rocking the boat. His mother, usually a pillar of support, now avoided him, her worry for him almost palpable. Every conversation with her now felt strained, like a thread stretched too thin, ready to snap. And then there were his classmates. Some had rallied behind him, quietly offering support in the halls. But others? They'd started to turn their backs, avoiding him in the corridors, whispering behind his back, labeling him as a troublemaker, as a distraction. Ethan had always felt like an outsider in his own school, but now, he felt it more than ever. He had always been the quiet kid, the one who preferred books and solitude to the chaos of social interaction. But this was different. This wasn't just about being quiet or loud. This was about his identity, his place in the world. This was about truth, about standing up for what was right in a world that had grown comfortable with its injustices. One evening, after another long day of interviews and threats, Ethan collapsed into his chair. The weight of it all felt unbearable. His body ached with exhaustion, but it was the exhaustion of his spirit that truly crippled him. He'd been fighting for so long, pushing against a system that seemed determined to crush him, to silence his voice. And yet, it felt like the harder he pushed, the more isolated he became. There were nights when he questioned whether he was even making a difference, whether his efforts were in vain. Was he just feeding into the chaos? Was this fight worth the pain? But then, in those moments of doubt, he'd think of the people who had reached out to him, who had thanked him for speaking out. He'd think of the young people who had come to him, looking to him for hope, for guidance, for the strength to take their own stands. They were the ones who kept him going, who reminded him that his voice mattered, that truth mattered. There was one message in particular that stuck with him, one that he received late one night when his mind was swirling with doubt. It was from Claire. She had been there from the beginning, a quiet presence in his corner when everyone else had retreated. "We're with you, Ethan," she wrote. "You're not alone. We're all in this together." Her words, simple but profound, brought a sense of peace, however brief. In that moment, Ethan realized that he wasn't fighting alone. Yes, the battle was hard, and yes, it was filled with loss and heartache, but he was not fighting for nothing. He was fighting for something greater, something that could change the world. The next morning, Ethan walked to school with a new sense of purpose. The air felt different, lighter somehow, as if the weight he had been carrying had shifted just a little bit. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. There would be more hate, more resistance, more moments of doubt. But now, he also knew that there was something worth fighting for. He was no longer just fighting for justice, he was fighting for himself, for the truth that he believed in so fiercely. As he entered the school building, he found his resolve hardening. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready for whatever came next. Because in the end, this was his story to write, and he would no longer let anyone else dictate the narrative. The weeks dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Ethan could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, suffocating him with every breath he took. His sense of isolation grew daily, a silent storm that churned within him, louder than the words of criticism that bombarded him from all directions. The faces around him, once filled with understanding and empathy, had transformed into masks of contempt and suspicion. The kind of suspicion that made him feel as though he were a stranger in his own life. Every time he walked into the school hallway, the whispers followed him, the pointed stares like daggers in his back. They all thought he was crazy, dangerous, reckless. But the truth, he couldn't escape it. It clawed at him, relentless and demanding, pushing him forward even when his body begged for respite. He knew there was no going back, not now. The moment he had exposed the truth about his father's disgrace, the lies had taken on a life of their own, and the consequences were unfolding with a terrifying speed he couldn't control. But what was worse? The fear that lingered in the pit of his stomach, or the crushing certainty that there was no other choice for him now. It had been a few days since the recording had surfaced, an audio file that had been buried for years, hidden beneath layers of corruption. The contents were damning, implicating high-ranking officials in a conspiracy to destroy his father. The kind of scandal that would shatter everything Ethan had once believed to be true about the system that was supposed to protect people like him. The moment he had listened to that recording, he knew what he had to do. He had to expose it. He had to let the world hear it, see the truth for what it was. No more silence. No more pretending. But it wasn't just the content of the file that terrified him, it was what it meant. What would happen if he released it? Would it bring the justice his father deserved, or would it destroy everything he had left? His mind raced, conflicted, torn between the need for justice and the fear of what it might cost him. He had been prepared for a fight, but this was more than just standing up to a few bullies or exposing some lies. This was about taking on a system, an entire institution, and bringing it down. It was a war that could cost him everything. The night before he made his decision, he sat alone in his dimly lit room, the soft glow of his laptop casting shadows across his face. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, every key feeling heavier than the last. The decision loomed in front of him, an immovable wall of uncertainty. His breath was shallow, his pulse quick, as if his body was betraying him, telling him to stop, to wait, to reconsider. But deep down, Ethan knew there was no more waiting. The world had already seen a glimpse of the truth, and there was no turning back. He had to finish what he started. He had no other choice. He clicked on the upload button, the finality of the action sending a jolt through his entire body. As the file uploaded, the seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Ethan sat frozen, the noise of his own heart thumping in his ears, as the truth began to ripple out into the world. The world would know now. And the world did know. The next morning, the headlines broke with a force that shook him to his core. His name was everywhere. The recording, his father's name, the corruption, it was all out in the open now. But with it came the backlash, the fury of people who had been blinded by their own power and privilege. Ethan's phone blew up with angry messages, threats, insults, accusations. His inbox was flooded with calls for him to take it back, apologize, or worse, to stay out of it before things got worse. His classmates turned away when he walked into a room, murmuring behind his back, some of them even openly accusing him of ruining everything. But Ethan didn't flinch. Not now. He stood there, in the center of it all, the weight of the storm pressing against him from every angle. It was almost suffocating, the hatred and judgment coming from all sides. But inside, he could feel something shift, a slow, steady rising of determination. He wasn't just doing this for his father anymore. He wasn't just fighting for justice. He was fighting for something bigger, something more important than any personal consequence. This was about the truth. It was about showing the world that things could be different, that people didn't have to stay silent when they saw the wrong being done. And yet, the fear gnawed at him. It wasn't just the external threats that haunted him, but the fear of losing himself, of becoming something he couldn't recognize. He had always been the quiet one, the one who kept his head down, never stirring the pot. But now, he was thrust into the center of a storm, a force of nature he had no control over. Could he really handle this? Could he deal with the weight of the truth, of the consequences, of the chaos that had exploded because of his actions? Still, in the depths of his uncertainty, Ethan knew one thing. He couldn't go back. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning around now. The world was watching. They knew the truth. Now, all he could do was face the consequences, whatever they might be. As the day wore on, and the world began to digest the chaos he had unleashed, Ethan felt a strange sense of finality settle over him. He had done it. The truth had been exposed, and there was no taking it back. But even in the midst of the storm, there was a quiet voice inside him, one that whispered in the darkest corners of his mind, that said he had made the right choice. He wasn't sure where this journey would take him, or if he could survive the fallout. But for the first time in his life, Ethan felt a sense of purpose, of clarity, rising above the fear and the noise. And in that moment, he knew, no matter what happened next, he had chosen to stand for something greater than himself. He had every reason to hate the world. To disappear. To become another forgotten tragedy. But because one person believed in him, he found the courage to speak. To fight. To change the course of lives beyond his own. She was never his mother. But she gave him what no one else did: safety, dignity, and a second chance. Justice doesn't always start in the courtroom. Sometimes, it begins with a knock at the door. And the choice to open it. This was their untold truth. And now, it's ours to remember. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it. Because every voice matters.